This episode of Crosscut Talks is supported by Alaska Airlines.
Hey, welcome to Crosscut Talks. I'm Mark Baumgarten, the managing editor at Crosscut, and today we're talking about death. You may not like to talk about death, but some scientists do. They actually find it critical to understanding life and how to extend it. Talking about life and death, though, is tricky for anyone, including scientists who, as a group, don't fully understand what life is, what death is, or even what separates the two of them. But where science lacks understanding, there are theories and questions about what is alive and how to keep living things from aging, and intriguing thoughts on the ethics of efforts to prolong life. To consider life and death, then, is to ponder over the greatest of mysteries, which is exactly what we're doing in today's conversation. Andrew Steele has a PhD in physics from Oxford University. After earning his degree, though, he decided that aging is the single most important scientific challenge of our time, which led him to switch fields to computational biology. He's also the author of the book, Ageless, the new science of getting older without getting old. Carl Zimmer is an author of 14 books and writes the New York Times column Matter. One of his many books is Life's Edge, the search for what it means to be alive. Leading the discussion is another scientist fascinated by the separation between life and death. Hallie Benasuti is a doctoral candidate for philosophy at University of Washington, where she's working on a degree in biochemistry. These three may not be able to define life, death, aging, or consciousness, but they certainly have very interesting insights into each. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you have any feedback, please send it to talks@crosscut.com. Okay, on with the show.
Carl and Andrew, welcome.
Hello.
Thank you.
All right, so as we are discussing life and death today, I think it would be good for us to all get on the same page as we go into this conversation. So I'll get the ball rolling with an easy question. This one's for Carl. How should we define life?
There's no good answer to that, I'm afraid. People want to have the answer, particularly in this political climate, but there isn't one. The scientists literally have hundreds of definitions, and they seem to be coming up with new ones every year. There are a variety of them, but each time that people come up with a new definition, others can poke holes in it. And that really tells us that fundamentally, we really don't understand what life is. Sorry.
No, I think that's what we're looking for here, right? That's what we're here to discuss today. So, in your research for your book, did you find that there was a definition of life that you sort of settled upon for yourself?
Well, you see, one of the problems with definitions of life is that we tend to we kind of know what life is. We know it in our bones. We know that we're alive. And so then we try to say, like, okay, what definition can I put together that will satisfy me about life? And, the fact is that, like, different people, including different scientists, have different things that are important to them. Is it, for example, homeostasis? That's this amazing ability of keeping like a stable environment inside of yourself while your environment around you is changing all the time. So some people will define life around homeostasis. Other people say, well, no, it's reproduction. I mean, that's it. That's what really matters. Okay, fine. But like, if I take, one rabbit, that one rabbit is not going to reproduce. So is it alive? And others will use evolution. And then sometimes people will just try to package it all together. So NASA, for example, came up with a definition. Some NASA scientists working with NASA came up with a definition, basically considering life as a chemically self-sustaining system capable of Darwinian evolution. Trying to pack it all in there. And they use that as a guide for looking for life on other planets. And that's that's fine. But there's no like theory behind it. It's just sort of it kind of emerged out of an all-day bull session, basically.
Yeah, for sure. That was actually, I was just about to ask that. How do we feel like what's the thought process for defining life that we might encounter in worlds that aren't our own? Just because it seems like our definition of life is so limited to what we perceive as life.
Yeah. I mean, you notice how in Star Trek, for example, all the aliens look suspiciously like Hollywood extras. So does that mean that all aliens on other worlds, if there are, will look like humans, or will they even be multicellular? If they are, let's say that there's life, microbial life out there. That's kind of, that's a possibility. Will they use DNA? Because like all life that we know of on Earth uses DNA. So does that mean it has to be DNA?
Yeah.
There's really no strong proof that that's the case. We could it's just that, it's conceivable like that there were different ways that life got started on Earth, and the DNA-based life won out. Some people think that actually life started as RNA. You can almost like, if you think of the little bubbles of RNA that people get in their Pfizer and Moderna shot, think of that as being the start of life, RNA-based life, little protocells. And then DNA-based cells kind of evolved out of that. And then they basically like ate all the RNA-based life and it's gone. So, what if there's something even better than DNA out there?
Yep. Oh, definitely. Yeah. That's what we know because it's what's around us, right? So, yeah. My next question is for Andrew. Welcome back, Andrew.
Hello.
How can we age without getting older and maybe even avoid dying? This is something that you focus a lot of your research on, and then that your book also.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think actually you might think that aging is one of these things that defines life. But what's really fascinating is if you look around the animal kingdom, although we age, all our friends, our families, our relatives, everybody we know, humans all age, a lot of the animals in our lives age as well. So if you look at your pets, your cats, your dogs, your mice, they all age in actually remarkably similar ways to human beings. They all get frail. They all suffer from very similar spectrum of age-related diseases. We've all seen, a dog with cataracts that can't quite see properly and arthritis in its joints. It really looks as though aging is this universal process. But if we cast the net a bit wider, and a really good example of this is a tortoise, which is the reason there's a tortoise on the cover of my book. It's because tortoises display a property called negligible senescence. And this is to say, basically, negligible means not very much, obviously, and senescence is just the scientific term for aging. And the way that we can define this most easily is to look at the risk of death and how that changes with time. So a human has something called a mortality rate doubling time that's about 8 years. And that means that, well, let's sort of break that down into an example. I'm 36, and what that means is this year I've got a risk of death of about 1 in 1,000. And actually, I quite like those odds, because what that means is I've got a less than 1 in 1,000 chance of not making my next birthday. But unfortunately, if you double that every 8 years, in 8 years' time, it's going to be 1 over 500. In 8 years' time again, it's going to be 1 over 250. These aren't too bad until you get to older and older ages. And eventually, if you keep doubling something, it can start getting very big very quickly. And so someone who's in their 90s has roughly a 1 in 6 chance of death every year. That's sort of life and death at the roll of a dice. And as a scientist, you look at that and think, wow, what is this, seemingly universal process that drags humans into a much increased risk of disease? But if we look for a moment at those negligibly senescent organisms, things like the tortoises, things like fish, even little things called hydra, there are a variety of different creatures out there that have this property. They have a risk of death that doesn't change with time. And that means that they effectively don't age. And actually, of course, what we care about isn't really so much the dying itself. It's the suffering, it's the diseases, it's the frailty, it's all those things that come along with it. And although death is a nice, easy thing to measure and a nice, easy thing to get a statistical handle on, actually, we see that these creatures don't experience these things increasing with time either. So it really does seem that there are lots of examples out there of animals, of plants, of all kinds of different things that get older without getting old.
Yeah, so it sounds like aging, the way in which you're sort of talking about it, we're talking about aging as being this one general process, but isn't aging composed of many different things going on within the body?
It is, yeah. And I think that was one of the things that's actually been a barrier to studying it for a very long time, because obviously there are, thousands and thousands of processes going on inside an individual cell, let alone inside the sort of complex interplay of our entire bodies, all these different cells working together in a variety of complicated ways. And I think scientists for literally decades, from the development of the theory of evolution, people thought that aging was just this impossibly complicated process. It was this, if you imagine, back in the 1800s, we had really, really good theories of physics, thermodynamics, basically saying that everything falls apart with time. That was one of the conclusions of the second law of thermodynamics, this sort of law of the universe. So why should animals be any different from steam engines, be any different from rocks and other things that make up the world around us? Well, actually, of course, now we understand that animals have these self-repair mechanisms, and that's one of the ways that we can stave off the aging process. But we've also come to understand that aging isn't one monolithic thing. It's exactly, it's almost as complicated as they would have predicted. But thankfully, we can break it down into a collection of processes that are sometimes known as the hallmarks of aging. And these 10 things are the different cellular, molecular, biochemical signatures of growing older. And they're things like damage to our DNA at the most fundamental, tiny levels inside our bodies. Then you can get dysfunction of whole cells. You can get senescent cells. That's that scientific word for old again. And then as these sort of things scale up, you can get to a point where whole systems in the body, and a really great example of that is the immune system. We've been reminded by coronavirus because it affects older people so much more than younger people. One of the reasons for that is that the whole immune system, our body's toolkit for fighting off external threats, also deteriorates with age. So luckily, we have managed to break it down into these distinct categories and come up with ideas for treating all of them. And that's really the sort of the dream of this science. It's fascinating to catalog all the different changes that happen as a part of aging. It really is, fundamental. It covers every aspect of our biology. But actually, what's really fascinating to me is the ability to intervene and do something about it.
Yeah. So then my follow-up question, which this is sort of the opposite of what I asked Carl at the beginning, and Carl, this is a question for you as well. I know that this is also a tough question to answer, as we don't really have a great definition for life right now. Do we have a great definition for death?
Do you want to go first, Carl?
Sure.
Give you that poison chalice.
Right. So just as we think that life is totally obvious and there must be a simple definition for it, we think, well, death, that's got to be obvious too. And I mean, clearly death is a thing. But when you try to draw that line to separate death from life, that's where things get potentially very tricky. And scientists have been struggling to define death as well as life for centuries. In the early 1800s, there was a French physician named Bichat who was trying to figure this out. And one of his favorite things to do was to go and to watch executions where people would get guillotined and then study their heads very carefully to try to figure out, well, are they dead yet in there? Because the head has been separated from the body. And he came up with a definition, which is that he defined life through death, which is interesting. He said life is the sum of functions by which death is resisted. So death becomes this thing that will just take over once life, whatever that is, gives way. The problem is that, just for humans, leaving aside the animal world, for humans, it's really hard to determine that because we keep getting better at preserving life. It used to be thought, like Bichat, for example, would believe that the heart and the brain and the lungs were sort of, inextricably linked together, so that if any one of them failed, then the whole thing failed and you're dead. Which was okay until people invented the iron lung and ventilators. And then it was possible to keep the lungs and heart functioning, even if the brain could no longer conduct that job. And that forced doctors eventually to say, this is not really life. This is kind of a death. And so that led in the 1960s to the definition of brain death. In other words, we legally define death as the death of the brain, because for a human being, it's that life in the brain which matters. We're not bacteria. Our body, there's still homeostasis going on, metabolism going on in the body of someone who's on a ventilator. But if there's no hope of that brain recovering any function, then that's what we consider that death. Although that itself can be controversial, and people do contest that still.
Yeah, I think I quite like that definition, that it's the sort of sum of the forces that resist death is what life is all about. I think actually that really does apply to the aging process, because there are just so many of these things that I actually think it's quite remarkable. That 1 in 1,000 figure that I quoted for my risk of death this year, it's really incredible that our bodies do maintain this homeostasis to such a sort of elegant, beautiful, precise degree that our chance of sort of falling off to one side or the other is remarkably low. And if you were to look at the safest humans of our current age, in fact, the safest humans in the history of humanity are current 10-year-olds. So if you're a 10-year-old in the rich world, you have a less than 1 in 10,000 chance of not making your 11th birthday because of that sum of processes that are trying to resist death. And I think Carl's absolutely right. One of the things that really I found remarkable reading about the history of medicine for my book was just how recently a lot of these things have happened. So, for example, it was thought that after your heart had stopped, you were dead for a very long period of time. But then, as recently as the 1960s, CPR was developed and rolled out. And you sort of imagine, what happens if somebody's heart stops? It's the most obvious thing in the world to try and give it a pump and start it again, isn't it? And it's sort of a staple of TV drama and films. We see this thing happen, every night on our TV screens. And yet, this really remarkably obvious with hindsight process wasn't even conceived of until the 1960s and started to be rolled out. And as a result, people are just living longer and longer and longer because we've completely changed our understanding of how it is that we can preserve life in older ages. And I think what's really exciting about the idea of researching aging is just that we can intervene so long before these death processes happen. Because I was thinking a bit about this for this panel earlier. What is it that causes us to actually be dead? Well, let's say it's brain death. That is in a way a little bit controversial, because it might be that your memories, your personality, all of those things that make you are still in there, and perhaps in the structure of your brain, for example. So it could be that once we get a more fundamental understanding, if we could come up with, rather than an iron lung, an iron brainstem that could maintain that activity, maybe we could keep people alive even longer. But putting that question to one side, and the fact we have been pushing that back further and further, what we'd like to do is get in there. We don't want to be giving people CPR, because CPR, in spite of what you might have seen in films, the huge majority of patients who are at that stage, end up dying, unfortunately. What we want to do is we want to prevent the processes that cause these hearts to stop, prevent the processes that cause brains, dying of themselves, things like dementia. And I think that's what really excites me, is we do have to understand these processes that they're sort of multiple steps removed from the actual process of death. But understanding the actual process of death and sort of peeling back the layers, one of the things I think is most important is understanding why we die and doing autopsies, particularly on older people who are often, if a 90-something dies in hospital, it's just considered so unremarkable. But actually, as you sort of begin to understand this, you realize that our understanding of the causes of death, particularly in the oldest old, are really in their infancy. And if we want to, do the best medical work we can to try and preserve a healthy life, then we've really got to understand what death is and, what causes it.
Well, this actually leads into sort of my next question is, if we need to understand life, then we need to understand death. And do we need to understand the beginning of all of that as well? For whoever wants to answer.
I think, yeah. And actually, I think this is one of the most fascinating things, is that we think of the aging process as this inevitable thing. And yet all of us have experienced in our day-to-day lives the process by which the human body knows exactly, there are tools within the human body to reverse aging. And the reason we know that is that you can get an old father, men can conceive even in their 60s, women can conceive in, perhaps in their 40s, even in their 50s in the sort of record-breaking cases. And yet the baby that those two people have will be born young. And that's a really obvious thing to say, almost sounds stupid. And yet it's clearly the case that whatever damage accumulates to the DNA of the egg cell, whatever changes happen inside that cell, the body is capable of reversing them to a very, very large extent. It's not the case that that the children of older parents tend to die before or tend to get age-related diseases sooner. They tend to live, pretty much normal lifespan. They're almost indistinguishable from, people who gave birth at the age of 16. So what is it that's going on inside our biology? I think that's really, really fundamental. And actually, this sort of realization has led to some fascinating and exciting movement in the biology of aging, in the field of actually treating it in the last few years. Because one of the big news stories in aging sort of at the end of last year was that Jeff Bezos, amongst others, a variety of billionaires of whom he was the most famous name, have invested $3 billion in a startup called Altos Labs. And the science that Altos Labs are getting behind is this idea of something called epigenetic reprogramming. And this is the idea that it was actually originally developed to study this process that happens at the start of life. There was a scientist called Shinya Yamanaka, Japanese chap who got the Nobel Prize a few years later for this discovery. He was trying to work out what it is that allows the clock to be turned back in those cells. And we could now use these things called the Yamanaka factors. These are 4 genes that are named after the guy who discovered them. And we could take a skin cell out of my arm, out of your arm. We could either get it out of a super centenarian. So when he was 115 years old, we could take a skin cell out of their arm, we can apply these 4 genes and we can reprogram those cells back to a point where they're what's called pluripotent. They're able to become any cell in the body, exactly as a cell that's just been fertilized, when a sperm meets the egg, for example, just at the very, very beginning of life. And what we found is that we can turn back the clock that whole way, but we probably wouldn't want that as an anti-aging treatment, because I don't want to turn into a massive glob of sort of primordial stem cells. I want my liver cells to stay liver cells, doing all the exciting things that liver cells do. I want my brain cells to stay as brain cells, and so on. But what we've discovered is that by applying these factors, rather than applying them to the extent where we turn the clock all the way back, we can actually apply them transiently. We can do it briefly. And one of the experiments in mice looked at doing this 2 days in every 7, rather than doing it for the sort of full duration of the week. So you can imagine turning on these Yamanaka factors at weekends, as it were. And what they found was that was enough to reverse the age of these mice somewhat. And it seemed to make them live a little bit longer and healthier, but without causing this sort of widespread change to pluripotency inside their bodies. And so I think, understanding the beginning of life has actually given us this incredible technology potentially to make some changes to what happens to all of us at the end of it.
Yeah, and I mean, what's fascinating is that even in the 1960s, as some of the early insights into the process that Andrew's talking about were really emerging, scientists were recognizing that, certainly in the United States, their work was going to be smacking right into some serious political conflicts. In Life's Edge, I write about a scientist named Joshua Lederberg, who had won the Nobel Prize for his work on bacteria. And he had a warning for Americans in general that they could not look to science for some simple answer about when life begins. He actually said, in fact, what he wrote was, life, in fact, never begins. And what he meant by that was that, if you are tracing any person's history, in terms of their cells, you can go back and back and back. If you reverse time, you're looking at a person when they're a fetus, when they're an embryo, when they're just a little clump of cells, when they're one cell, and before that, they're 2 cells. In other words, there's an unbroken continuity, a biochemical continuity from that egg and that sperm in the parents' bodies. You can trace all the components inside of it, all the proteins and the genes, all those elements that are combined and then continue to interact. And so, for scientists, when they're thinking about life, they don't think about it with some sort of legal definition of, quote unquote, when life begins. And the Supreme Court, when it made its decision about Roe v. Wade, literally they said, we don't have to get into when life begins. But we are looking very much at that now politically, because there is going to be an argument about, well, when does life begin? There are these personhood movements and so on that are claiming that life begins at conception. And in Life's Edge, I talk about all the problems that science poses to that kind of very simple view of what we mean by life and beginning.
Yeah, definitely very relevant topic to be considering right now, for sure. Another relevant topic that I'm really excited to talk with y'all about, because I work with modified viruses, and us being 2 years into this pandemic, what are your thoughts on viruses being alive? This is something that I know in my field is like every single scientist has a different opinion, but do you all have any thoughts that you would like to share?
I have the strange experience of getting emails from virologists telling me what to think about viruses. And literally on one day, it's the same day in the morning, I got an email from one virologist who said, I just read what you were writing about whether viruses are alive or not. I mean, of course they're not alive, and any virologist will tell you. And then that afternoon, another virologist emailed me to say, of course viruses are alive. I mean, you can't understand them if you don't think about them as being alive. It's meaningless. And any expert will tell you. So I think that just gives you a sense that, like, I, as a journalist, am not going to be stepping in where these virologists clearly do not agree. But that's what's so cool in a sinister way about viruses, which is that they are, you know, you can think of them as half alive. I mean, in the sense that I mentioned earlier the NASA definition of life, you know, as a chemically self-sustaining system that is capable of Darwinian evolution. So viruses are not self-sustaining in that sense of having like metabolism and homeostasis. Like, they don't have it. It's a package of genes. But evolution, you bet. I mean, these variants that we're dealing with now that are just continuing to draw out this pandemic, that's evolution in action. And so here you have something that definitely is not alive in some respects and definitely is alive in other respects. So, you know, it makes them incredibly interesting, you know, partly because maybe that gives us a clue about, you know, maybe how life began, that there might be these sort of intermediate forms that that sort of provide a sort of a jumping off point for life. But, you know, viruses don't grow and you know, and viruses don't grow old. They just are, and either they infect a new cell or they don't.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question. I think the thing that I would say is
oh, we lost Andrew again. Oh, I was very curious to hear what he was going to say.
Bummer. I know, me too. Well,
yeah, sorry he's having this camera trouble. But anyway,
get him back there. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting thing to think about in terms of when we think about it moving through a population like we do, or like in my research, we're using a modified virus that does not replicate once it enters a cell. So it's basically kind of like a useless virus. We actually use it for the delivery of therapeutics. But in that sense, too, it's like, well, if it's not replicating, and, you know, again, it's definitely a very complicated topic that we're on today, huh?
I'm one of the most, what I find one of the most thought-provoking ways of thinking about whether viruses are alive or not is to say sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't. And this is actually a theory or a model that's been put forward by some scientists. One in particular in France, he's named Patrick Forterre, and so Forterre, you know, says, well, you know, when a virus is just out there floating outside of a cell, what sometimes is called a virion, it's not alive, he'll say. When it infects a cell, though, that cell becomes something new. So he argues that, you know, and we have. Sometimes we just think of a cell as just with a virus in it as just sort of like, you know, kind of a beleaguered cell, a cell with a, you know, feeling a little under the weather, or, you know, just. But the fact is that you know, in so many different ways, a cell that's got a virus inside of it is no longer its former self. It is now a virus factory. And so Forterre calls it a virocell. Because like when you get SARS, if you get SARS, I hope you don't get SARS, but you know, when a person gets SARS, then the virus goes into a cell, it does this, one of the many amazing things that it does is it goes to these factories where our cells make our own proteins from our own genes and plugs them up. It locks the door so that we can't get the RNA into those factories to make new proteins for our cells.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
But
sorry. Hello,
sorry.
I'm back.
Good.
I was just going to jump in where I left off, but please finish your thought.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say that the amazing thing with viruses when they infect cells is that they can, so they lock the door to those factories, but they have the key. So in other words, the cell is only making viral proteins. which then assemble into new viruses. And it's this astonishing, sophisticated switch over to what some scientists argue is a new and distinct form of life that's not like the cell before it. So viruses go back and forth between being alive and not alive.
Definitely. And it's hard to think that something that hijacks a cell that way would not be alive. Too.
I think that's a really lovely way of thinking about it. And what I was going to say is that I think a lot of this debate, without coming down hard on one side or the other for all the reasons Carl's already outlined, I think that we imagine viruses, they're parasites. They can't exist without being inside a cell, essentially, or at least occasionally being inside a cell in order to replicate themselves. But actually, if you think about it, basically that's true of all of life. Like you might say, am I alive? Are you alive? Well, I do depend on quite a lot of things. I need to eat food, which is essentially, plants, it's animals, it's other life. I need to breathe the oxygen that's produced by the plants on planet Earth. So we're all part of this much larger symbiotic system. And actually, one thing that a bit of a problem back when the human genome was first sequenced. This was back in the early 2000s. We just suddenly had this access to this 3 billion letter long genetic code that's inside every one of our cells. I think some people in computational biology were quite overawed by this incredible new sort of data, this power that we had to look inside the human body and decode it on a level that we hadn't previously achieved. But actually, this led to a sort of reductionism and looking at DNA as being this sort of fundamental part of life, when actually, you can sort of think of DNA as being like a floppy disk, in the sense that if you don't put the floppy disk, and let's try and update this analogy, make it into an SD card, try and bring that up, in case anyone in the audience has absolutely no idea what I'm talking about with a floppy disk. You can't read an SD card without having the SD card reader on your computer, without having the software on your computer to decode the data on that SD card. And it's exactly the same with DNA. If I got some of the DNA out of one of my cells and just dolloped it on the side, it would be no more alive than a virus. It would be no more alive than anything else. That DNA needs the machinery of the cell to be able to read that information and reproduce it, which sounds remarkably like a virus, actually, when you put it like that. So I think that this is a problem we keep running into, whether it's death, whether it's life. The reason these things are very hard to define is actually we're all part of this, without getting too hippie, massive symbiotic, where are the boundaries of this organism? Can we call the whole Earth an organism? In the same way as an anthill might be a more sensible organism than the individual ants themselves. Drawing these lines is just absolutely nightmarish. And so I think I'm erring towards viruses being alive, but I won't come down on either side.
Again, those chats with the virologists might change your mind one way or the other. He's in the middle, like Carl.
We'll be back with more after this message.
Dreaming of a long-awaited vacation? Take your travels to the next level with Alaska Airlines. They're committed to providing a higher standard of safety and cleanliness throughout your journey. From mask requirements and touch-free options to HEPA filters on board and fresh air every 2 to 3 minutes. Plus, their award-winning loyalty program, Mileage Plan, makes it easy to earn and redeem miles wherever you go, including destinations worldwide, thanks to their One World Alliance membership. If you're ready to land a low fare, next-level care, and the best experience in the air, book now at alaskaair.com.
All right. We have a lot of audience questions, and I think that it would be kind of fun to get into some right now. So the first question I have from Richard Sanford: if we prolong lifespan, what are some of the ethical issues, such as older workers not retiring, who get access to life-prolonging supplements and interventions, etc.? And Andrew, I know that you are well-versed in this because I understand that you get this question a lot.
I do, yeah. I think actually it's remarkable. At the end of a talk, I'll far more often get these kinds of ethical questions. And, even before, how do I extend my own life? How do I live as long and healthy as possible? The number one question I get, actually, it's interesting to have older workers being thought about. The question I get most often is, what are we going to do with all the people? What about the population of the planet if we start prolonging lifespans? And I'm not going to have time, unfortunately, to cover every single ethical quandary in the next sort of 2 minutes. What I would say is, if anyone's interested, there's a free chapter of my book. You can go and read about this at ageless.link/ethics, which goes into far, far more detail than I have time to here. To specifically address the older workers thing, I actually think this is a problem that we already have because, if you look back at what's happened to lifespan over the last 200 years, we've been increasing in the best performing country in the world, the life expectancy by an average of 3 months per year, every single year. And the straightness of this line, it's almost suspicious as a statistician looking at this. You think, how is it that this sort of tangle of sociological, of medical factors has conspired in some way to have this sort of tick-tock 3 months every single year increase in life expectancy? And what that means is that kids born in the rich world today are lucky enough to have a life expectancy we think is probably going to be up at around 100. And that means they're going to be living 20 years longer than their parents. Perhaps we'll have to just wait and see exactly how that pans out. But careers are already substantially longer than they were even a few decades ago. The retirement age of 65, which is really commonly cited as where people become old, quote unquote, if we can, again, defining old is hard, just as hard as defining life and death is. But that retirement age was first defined in the UK in the 1920s. And that was at a time when only a handful of people made it to age 65. And if you did, you were probably very frail and very sick. And so we introduced the old age pension basically to, as a sort of apology to them, to allow them to bow out of the workforce and, live out their last few years with a bit of money in peace. And yet that pension age wasn't changed until 2019. And life expectancy had increased by 23 years over that period. So there's just this absolutely incredible blindness by policymakers. This is a problem that we're going to have to deal with anyway. And one of the sort of common questions you get about aging workers is to look at the field of science. There's this famous quote by Max Planck that science advances funeral by funeral. And isn't it the case that, if we're going to enable professors who honestly, often stay, they keep working until they're 80, some of these emeritus professors, they've got incredible stamina. Aren't we slowing down scientific progress by doing this? And this, you could make a very similar argument in political arguments and all other kinds of workplaces. Some clever studies that have been done in this find the effect is quite ambiguous. But if the effect is present, it's actually detectable at current scientific career length. So people have looked at premature deaths of sort of superstar scientists with loads and loads of publications that, die in a car crash or something. And what you find is that has a hugely detrimental effect on, obviously that particular scientist is dead, so they can't publish anymore, and their direct collaborators who are working on that particular theory. But it actually encourages growth in other parts of the field. And so if that is indeed a problem in science, and obviously, whether or not continued research on one particular line or a broader investigation encouraged by the dropout of that superstar is the preferable model, is going to vary from field to field. But since that is observable within current careers, maybe current scientific careers are already too long, and we need to enforce term limits for professorships, just like we do for presidencies. And I think that's the sort of thinking we need to apply to all kinds of different careers, because, if people are able to work and work and work and accrue more and more wealth and so on, these are problems that I think we need to solve from a societal point of view, because the most common answer I give to all of these questions, whatever they are, is to reverse the question. And imagine we lived in a society where there was no aging, where people just lived an incredibly long time in health and vitality with much, much lower levels of disease than currently. Would we invent aging to solve the problem of intergenerational inequality? I really don't think we would. It's absolutely barbaric. This huge, huge cause of human suffering. We'd come up with some political way to solve that problem. And I really think that that's the approach we should be taking now, rather than saying, should we and ah about whether to deploy life-saving medicine in order to try and solve that problem for us.
Thank you. Carl, do you have any thoughts to contribute?
Oh, it's so fascinating to think about, partly just because, as Andrew's book demonstrates, that this is not total science fiction, that there's more and more real biology to look at and to understand and to base our ideas on. One question that I have in the back of my mind is actually about minds, in the sense that, like, there could be, in terms of aging, there could be some, treatments to slow down aging that work throughout the body, and in the sense of resetting some of the molecules in our cells that Andrew had touched on and talks about more in his book. But through time, our brains change, and not just in the sense of that biochemical level, but the network changes. So the way that the brain functions is different at 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, and so on. And so, if people are living to be, 150 or 200 years old, how are those brains working? Are those the brains that are functioning as, that young, vibrant scientist full of new ideas, or, maybe somebody who just is, kind of, that it sort of has that certain grandparent type wisdom / stubbornness, or something else? What is that mind of that extremely old person going to be like?
Especially
it's a great question.
Solve the problem of aging.
Yeah, I'm actually quite optimistic about this. And the reason is that if you look at a lot of the studies that have been done where we have demonstrated that mice, all the sort of leading work in this is being done in mice at the moment, you find that not only do you rejuvenate the sort of the sort of bodily health side of things, they get lower risk of cancer, lower risk of heart disease and that kind of stuff. They actually seem to have a lower cognitive age as well. And I think the most, obviously it's quite hard, you can't give a mouse a maths test or something. So what they tend to do is do things like put them in a maze, and a young mouse will have a huge amount of curiosity about its new environment. It'll want to look around, see if there's any food. Older mice tend to be more anxious. Maybe they're just a bit more lazy psychologically, and so they are much less exploratory. But by a variety of different anti-aging treatments, we seem to be able to reverse that aging in the brain as well. And obviously we can't really do a proper, like I sort of alluded to, cognitive experiment on mice in terms of how they think or something like that. But my hope is that we'll have the wisdom that we've accumulated throughout those extended lifespans, but the youthful mental agility. And I guess we'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to move on to another audience question from Melissa Westbrook. For people in countries with lower life expectancies, does that mean they will perceive big life differently?
That's a really good question. I think that actually one of the things that's quite remarkable about this is actually when I do an in-person event, I normally do this as an audience quiz. So I'm going to try and get everyone to imagine this at home. What do you think is the average life expectancy around the world right now? So this is not just in the rich countries, but in all of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia and that sort of stuff. If you were to average every country in the world, what do you think that number is? So just give everyone a second to think about that. The answer in 2019, which is the most recent data we have, and a bunch of strange stuff has happened in the last couple of years for obvious reasons, but it was 72.6 years. That's the average life expectancy around the world. And so that means with that continuously increasing, it's actually increasing faster in the poorer countries, that most people in most countries are living these fantastically long lives by historical standards. If you look back at most of human history, life expectancy was maybe 30 or 40 years old. We've almost doubled that for every country in the world now, which is just a fantastic achievement. So I think that there definitely will be some difference in perception. But I think what's really remarkable, and I think perhaps a problem that we've got with our perception in the rich countries, is that we look around the world and we imagine there's this enormous, poor, developing world where people have much, much lower life expectancies. But mercifully, particularly over the last 50 years, that has in large part ceased to exist. I think about 10% of people live in countries now with a life expectancy below 65. And we've obviously got a huge moral responsibility to do something about that. But that means that 90% of people in, basically most countries in the world are living such long lives that actually that question is less relevant than it might seem at first.
Awesome. Such a cool response. It's definitely really interesting to think about. So Carl, this one's for you from Sue. What do you think about artificial intelligence? Is that life?
Yeah, I actually, in Life's Edge, I made a very conscious decision not to write about artificial intelligence and not to write about artificial, quote unquote, life. Just partly because, obviously the subject of life is huge, and I wanted to write a book that would not also also serve as a doorstop. And I felt like I had an excuse because I was talking one day with a biologist named Kate Adamala, and Kate is actually trying to create life from scratch. She is working with RNA molecules and basically wants to make kind of a protocell that can grow and divide and evolve and do all the kind of things we think of that life can do. She hasn't gotten there yet, but she's done all sorts of cool research. And so, here's this scientist on this remarkable quest who thinks a lot about life because she's trying to make it. And I said, so what do you think? I'm wondering whether I should write about artificial life. And she's like, no, it's not life. And I was like, what? And it's not? And she said, no, it's not. I was like, why not? And I was like, well, she said, it was so memorable. She said, well, I have something I call the GOO rule. So that's GOORULE. I was like, what is the GOO rule? And then she said, if it doesn't have goo in it, it's not life. In other words, it's not interesting to her to think about a computer program that kind of behaves in some ways that seem lifelike. The really hard problem in science is figuring out how is it that real molecules come together and produce something that we call life, even though we're not quite sure what life is. Like, that's the problem. That's the hard problem that it does not have an answer yet, and that people like Kate Adamala are trying to answer that big question. And so lets me off the hook. Although I know that I've talked to computer scientists who are like, what? Wait, what? You can't, no, you have to. and they get very angry, and I sympathize. And I think, they feel like, well, whatever it is that we're building, they like to call them digital organisms. They do something that's really interesting, and it's interesting in the same way that conventional life is interesting. So there are these amazing pieces of software that where basically there are these little batches of code that copy themselves and mutate and evolve and develop, acquire amazing new capabilities. You can actually get them to evolve the ability to do certain kind of logical operations, kind of like, the fundamentals of math. And you look at the program and you're like, how are they doing that? I don't know what they're doing, but they're doing it. And you can have sexual digital organisms and asexual ones, and it's a great fun. But the question there was about artificial intelligence, which is interesting. These bits of code, I don't think anybody say like, oh, that's really intelligent. What we are captivated by are, these programs that are being put out by places like Google that can play chess and do all sorts of things that we do with our highly evolved, front of the brains. Because for us, the life that matters, like I was saying before, is that life of the brain. And so we kind of want to make artificial intelligence stand in for life. And it's not. Artificial intelligence is, it's this, in some ways, it's a mimicry of certain kinds of architectures in our brain. And that's it. Now, could some form of artificial intelligence develop consciousness? I don't know. I'm skeptical. But then again, we don't have a good definition of consciousness. And so, certainly like the fact that all of us are conscious, to us, that's like the most obvious sign that we're alive. Like, well, I'm here. It's me, And so if a computer becomes conscious and we've decided that that's the hallmark for ourselves, then we would have to say that thing is alive. But that's just all based on what are the assumptions we're going into it. And, I think they're kind of questionable.
Yeah. Andrew, do you have anything to contribute?
I think it's fascinating. I think that we're going to, perhaps if Carl does a second edition of Life's Edge in 5 or 10 years, he might revisit this, because we're really at this fascinating time in artificial intelligence where I think, so to sort of take the side that these things aren't alive, they certainly aren't alive at the moment in any meaningful sense, because we have, I think, the world's largest computer, I'm right in saying, the world's largest, and this is a supercomputer, this is rooms and rooms and rooms full of computing hardware, has about the same processing power as the human brain. That isn't to say it can do the things the brain can do at all, but it can crunch numbers. It can do operations, is what computer scientists call this, at about the same speed as the brain. So we're finally at this hardware point where we can think about doing interesting, brain-like things, perhaps. The challenge is the software, and it's trying to work out, how it is that life, takes that amount of processing power, but turns it to so much more diverse range of applications. We might not be able to crunch numbers as fast as a computer, but we can just do so many different tasks. And so, that's the real fascinating question. And I think that, looking at the progress that we've had, even in the last 12 months, is there have been these fascinating, massive, what are called language models, which are artificially intelligent. And they basically ingest the entire text of the internet and every book that was ever written. And you can ask them surprisingly complicated questions, and they give you such coherent answers you'd never realize they weren't written by a human. You can get them to explain jokes even, and they'll explain sort of the inner mechanics of why is this particular statement is funny. And it's getting really quite eerie now. And so I'm wondering, there's a theory that we can basically just throw computing power at these things. And if we give them enough computing power, if we make these models large enough, they'll start to accumulate some of the properties that we would describe as intelligence. And consciousness, again, that's every word we've used in this whole hour has been something that we find impossible to define. But they're really starting to accumulate some of the characteristics of what it might mean to be alive. And so I think that, potentially within the next 5 or 10 years, we're going to have to think about that. And certainly in the next 50 years, goodness knows what's going to happen.
I mean, it's interesting, Andrew, that a lot of the times when people are advocating for all of the kind of life extension, some of the things that you touch on in your book, it's so that we can live long enough that that computers and artificial intelligence will be such that we can, find a kind of immortality by being uploaded into a machine. And again, like, because somehow our consciousness being transferred into a machine, then that makes us continue to be alive and to be alive as long as somebody keeps that computer plugged in.
Yeah, I feel like it's very strange that sometimes these things are sort of discussed in the same breath. I can imagine people today, through anti-aging therapy, being able to live a little bit longer and a little bit longer still, and that gives scientists longer to develop the next anti-aging therapy and so on. But the challenge of this idea of mind uploading, it's so, the biology of it's just incredible. You realize that it's going to require petabytes of storage, and that's like a couple of orders of magnitude, several thousand times bigger than current computer hard drives, and it's going to require so much processing power. I just think, and a lot of aging biologists absolutely hate the word immortality. I'm among their ranks, but I think we're going to achieve something that looks like biological immortality so long before we're going to start uploading brains. But I do think that artificial intelligence is going to have a huge role to play in terms of helping us build models of the human body that will allow us to really, fundamentally understand not just the aging process, but whole different swathes of disease, and come up with, really exciting, innovative treatments that are just beyond this tiny little lump of matter in our heads.
Thank you so much, y'all. I hate to break this conversation because it has been so fun chatting with you, but we're going to have to stop there. So thank you for taking the time to join the Crosscut Festival this year, and for having a really fascinating conversation with me. Lots to think about coming out of this talk for sure, and I really appreciate the work that you all are doing in exploring these topics.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's it for today's episode. Thanks again to Hallie, Andrew, and Carl for the talk. And thanks also to the folks in the audience who asked questions. If you'd like to be one of those audience members for a future Crosscut event, go to crosscut.com/events. This episode of Crosscut Talks was produced by Sarah Bernard and Brooklyn Jamerson Flowers, and engineered by Rusty Bacall and Victoria Ralph. And the event was produced by Jake Newman and Andrea O'Meara. And Chris Novich managed our audience engagement. You can subscribe to Crosscut Talks wherever you listen, and if you like the show, please review us. It helps other people find us. For the latest political, environmental, and culture news from the Pacific Northwest, visit crosscut.com. And if you would like to support the work that we do at Crosscut, whether it's the live events we host every month or the in-depth reporting we deliver every day, go to crosscut.com/membership. In addition to supporting our journalism, members receive complete access to the on-demand programming of Seattle's PBS station, KCTS-9. Crosscut Talks is a product of Cascade Public Media. I'm Mark Baumgarten. We'll be back soon with another conversation.